So welcome back, everybody, for this panel. In the course of the morning, we've been progressively widening, if you like, the aperture. We began with the Baltic Sea region. Then we moved on to former High Representative Ashton's remarks from the vantage point of the European Union. And now we're going to take an even broader look at Ukraine 2014 between Brussels, Moscow, and Washington. And we have a terrific panel to discuss this. First up is going to be Vygaudas Ušackas. We've already heard him mentioned. The key point here is that at that time he was the EU ambassador to Moscow. He will then be followed by Mark Voyger, now of the American University at Kyiv. But at that point he was a Russian and Eurasian advisor to General Ben Hodges, commander of the US forces in Europe, and of course himself a man who is well known both as a friend of Ukraine and a commentator on the military situation. And then finally we will go to Sergey Utkin, online unfortunately, but it's great to have him with us nonetheless. And he's now at the University of Southern Denmark, but his background is having been inter alia at the Primakov Institute for World Research. And finally, then Baroness Ashton, who has already spoken, will then respond to what was said. So, Vygaudas, over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thanks to Charles and Donatas and to everyone who helped organize this symposium. I think it's very important that during those critical times, we don't lose the sight, not only over Ukraine, but also over the Baltic states and the Baltic Sea region, and that's where your Global Center and your initiative plays an important role. Secondly, I wish to thank Baroness Catherine Ashton for her trust and an amazing support she extended not only to me, but also to every European Union diplomat during the first years of the creation of what we called, very difficult term, European External Action Services. I called it European diplomacy, let's put it straightly. And I really admired her dedication and the talent and driving force she demonstrated during the not only creation of the diplomacy of the European Union, but also in tackling and promoting our shared values and interests. I arrived to Moscow September 2013 as appointed EU ambassador. And, as Kathy had already mentioned, I was indeed received in a quite of interesting responses. On the one hand, European Union family, the EU delegation and the member states were very excited and very welcome to have someone who understood Russia from within and from outside, and who had already proved his credentials both as a foreign minister but also as EU ambassador in Afghanistan prior to that. At the same time, there were different receptions. Sergey Lavrov, who bluntly told me, "Gosh, you're so dangerous. You not only speak Russian, but you even think Russian." and then with all due respect, and I think that's the reason why Kathy selected me as ambassador to Russia. And then there were also very, strange evaluations, which Sergei may remember, when the Moscow Times quoted one prominent European EU business leader in Moscow, comparing the decision to send to Moscow a Lithuanian to represent the European Union would be the same shame as to send Israeli to represent the United Nations in Iran. So that was a mixture of receptions I received, but nevertheless, I really appreciate that experience. So at that time, when relations in September 2013 were strained but still functioning. Officially, we were still building so-called a strategic partnership with Russia, an ambitious plan of, common market from Lisbon to Vladivostok. We were working with anticipation of the free visa regime and etc. On practical level, however, our efforts to engage Moscow had not yielded much, but still allowed open channels of communication. Already in 2013, I vividly remember the EU was faced with, few challenges when it comes to Russia, especially in trade. You know, there were some impediments on exporting German pork meat to Russian market, Lithuanian milk, or Finnish timber. But that also, expanded to the energy-related feuds, to the very mounting pressure of the Russian authorities on civil society and disregard of human rights. But only a few months later, our relations with Russia plunged to the lowest points in the Cold War because of Russia's annexation of Crimea and the war in Ukraine. And my task as a EU ambassador at that time was to staunchly defend European Union values and interests, but at the same time still maintain bridges with Russia. As I left my post in November 2017, I was pessimistic that Europe and Russia will return to being partners anytime soon. The differences were vast and about principles of European security. I was and remain optimistic, however, about the EU's ability to stick to our own values and principles and to remain united in the face of countervailing pressures. But that will require, as it was required in 2014, 2022, and today, a strong political will and staying power by European leaders. In my farewell interview to Kommersant newspaper in October 2017 and later published article in The Guardian, I asserted and tried to prognose the following. I said that whatever happens in Russia between then and 2024 elections, supposed to be, the clash of the worldviews between Russia and the West will continue. At the heart of this clash are fundamental differences over Ukraine and Georgia's right to choose the alliances and their association with the West. This clash was about Russia's forceful annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass. But it's also about the core European values. Inside Russia, we are likely to continue to witness a rejection of civil society activism, freedom of speech, and political pluralism. Foreign investors, as we now see, will also face uncertainties because of increased protectionism, weak of rule of law, and political unpredictability. And the Russian leadership will continue to reject the outcome of the Cold War and insist on a new European security order based on spheres of interest rather than the free choice of nations to forge the alliances. Russia's respect to sovereignty and territorial integrity of its neighbors, but only when their geopolitical choices align with Russia. What did I not foresee, I must confess now, is indeed that Russia will bluntly and unprovokedly will launch a conventional war of a 19th century style towards Ukraine by sending the tanks to take over Kiev. And that's something I think very few people, except of US intelligence, as we know from the reports, were assessing and alerting both Ukrainians and Europeans. So where we are now, after 10 years, if I still have 5 minutes, very briefly, and I would, in summary, I would say we see situation glass full and glass half full and glass half empty. Relations are back in the worst stage of the history, what I call it as a hot war. Under different counts, over 600,000 casualties on both sides and 2-3 million Ukrainians displaced. The war against Ukraine, but also threats to the security of EU and NATO member states, especially the Baltics, Poles, and the others. Ukraine has demonstrated an incredible sense of unity, resilience, political will, and military capacity to withstand an outnumbered enemy. NATO is back to its origins to defend its territorial integrity. Ukraine war also saw belated birth of a geopolitical European Union which has committed to establish 5,000 strong rapid deployment capacity. NATO has placed US, German, UK Canadian troops in the Baltics, US troops in Poland. And Germany has halted that, certification of that very controversial Nord Stream 2 and committed to increase its budget by allocating 100 billion euros and reaching 2%, which is of critical importance not only for Germany but for the entire European Union. At the same time, we unfortunately witness that the West maintained unity over Ukraine, albeit not sufficiently quick and effective delivery of aid for what is required for Ukraine's defense and counter-defense. So what bothers me at night are the following. First is about high expectations over results of Ukraine's counteroffensive last year created a widespread disappointment. The US and European inability to step up the arms production resulted in the lack of critical weaponry supplies to Ukraine. The war has become of an attrition reminiscent to the First World War. Western sanctions, with all due respect, have proven ineffective, not only at punishing Russia's economy, although some individuals that affected harshly, but also not reducing Russian capacity or will to wage a war. Brainwashed, intimidated, and passive Russian society by and large remain either supportive or timid over the criminal acts of Putin's gang. While Western support remains crucial for both Ukraine's economic survival and its defense capability, it cannot replace its manpower, which is arguably most critical resource in Russia's war of attrition. Without urgent United States congressional approval of $62 billion additional military assistance, soon the odds are that Russia may continue to make gains, and that some could be dramatic by the time of the 75th NATO summit in July in Washington, just ahead of the US presidential elections. Also noteworthy is the mood of public in Europe as well. As you probably saw, European Council Foreign Relations recently issued a report about views of public in 12 EU member states. On average, only 10% of Europeans across those 12 countries believe that Ukraine will win. Over 30% believe Russia will win. Therefore, Putin continues to bank on war fatigue in the West to achieve Russian victory. And then, what? As Kathy titled her book. And I know that there is an elephant in the room which is very sensitive to touch, but which in the mood of Cambridge academic freedom and being a friend of Ukraine and having gone through some bitter experience in other parts of the world, which Kathy knows so well, Afghanistan, which produced a dramatic failure of the Western commitment, tragedy of the people, especially women. I feel obliged to reckon some lessons and to give or to share my own opinion what will be required as we move forward. As some experts suggest, it seems that we, especially the Baltic, the Poles, I would also include the Brits and the Norwegian and the Nordics, who are the strongest advocates for sustained and enhanced weapon supplies for Ukraine, may gain higher resonance among decision makers in other Western capitals if we would couple that urgent need to a discussion about the end goal, namely the circumstances under which the war could come to a close. As the history have shown, the victory and the end game will not be perfect and convenient at all and to all. But it might be the way forward, at least for the time being, so as to reduce the casualties and to retain security and stability in the territories which is controlled under Ukraine. It will be up to Ukrainians and not the friends of Ukraine and not the rest of the world to dictate or to suggest if at all and when to start negotiations. But as Kathy mentioned too, the wars end with negotiations. And you have to negotiate not with the friends, but with enemies. As I did under blessing of Cathy Ashton with some of Taliban leaders back in and outside of Afghanistan. It's not pleasant, but it's about the peace. It's about life. It's about negotiating the space where you can come back in a stronger position and regain something what belongs to you. And I'm not the one who will make the shots. I'm not, any more government official, even if I wear the EU pin as a proud former EU ambassador of European Union. But I think the components of that incoming, inevitably, the escalatory stage through negotiations and negotiating a settlement will have to include the following. It will have to include an immediate and urgent, massive military and financial support to Ukraine so that it regains the momentum and is in a position to talk to the enemy from the position of strength and the lead. It will also have to include an unprecedented political decision by both Europeans and NATO to expedite negotiations of Ukraine's membership in the European Union and invite Ukraine to join NATO at the Washington summit. It will also have to include what Emmanuel Macron bravely announced about the possible deployment of the NATO troops in Ukraine as a reassurance to Ukrainians and as a deterrent to Russia not to entertain any more military adventures. And I think the time is now to act in a spirit of coalition willing. So as we have plans in place so as to support. And last but not least, it will inevitably require brokerage of, participation and leadership of United States and EU, both from within and behind, to enforce the ceasefires and appropriate elements of settlement agreement directly, but also indirectly through other key players in the world, including India, China, Turkey, and other countries. So those are my humble thoughts in the spirit of academic freedom of Cambridge. I hope that will provide additional discussion, and I look forward to hear your views and respond to your any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'm sure there will be responses to those very interesting remarks. But now we turn to Mark Voyger.
All right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Professor Sims, Dr. Kopchunas, so thank you for kindly extending the invitation to me to participate in your highly acclaimed symposium on geopolitics. It's an honor for me to be part of such an august group of global leaders and be on the same panel actually with Baroness Ashton and with Ambassador Ušackas, Kathy and Vygaudas. Thank you so much for your continued friendship, your support for Ukraine, and in particular for American University Kyiv, which I represent here. On a personal level, I always enter these hollow walls of knowledge, global knowledge, with a certain dose of trepidation and a great respect, as I did back in 2008 when I was just beginning to read for a PhD in Oriental Studies of all disciplines, researching the Jeffersonian campaigns, the American campaigns against the so-called Barbary pirates at the time. And I had just finished working for Governor Mitt Romney as a member of his Russia team back in Boston, Massachusetts. So you're probably wondering, why is he starting to talk about Russia and talking about ancient history and Barbary pirates? Well, what I was exploring is how Jefferson, this early American leader and visionary, was creating a coalition of Western nations to fight the so-called, as I said, the Barbary states, those North African pirates who were acting on behalf of the Ottomans and disrupting the Western trade with the Levant, which was vital at the time. So despite the fact that 2 centuries ago the young American Republic lacked the proper military resources, the international expertise and experience, to really launch such a global effort, Jefferson demonstrated this unique set of initiative, resourcefulness, and creativity. All these qualities that lie at the core of global leadership. And during his presidency, America tried to punch way above its weight. It did so gallantly, valiantly, with the scanty forces that it possessed. Ultimately, his efforts to form a pan-European coalition failed, not for lack of trying, but his strategic vision and his intent became an inspiration for others. And by the way, Great Britain actually, in 1816, took upon itself to finish the job and suppress piracy. So, why I'm saying all this? Certainly I recognize that any attempt to try to analyze, assess in retrospect the effectiveness of all lack thereof, of any foreign policies that are designed and executed by global leaders is always tricky. I mean, we always run the risk of becoming anachronistic almost, this trap of trying to blame politicians for doing or not doing something just because they didn't know all the entire situation, all the facts at the time. In this regard, so how does the early American record of global leadership, this Jeffersonian model, if you will, of European engagement, America and Europe bound together to provide security and in global order, so how does it compare with the US response to what transpired in Crimea and in Ukraine more broadly a decade ago, in Crimea, also on the plains of Donbass? Well, we fast forward to 2014, and we see Russia, a resentful former Eurasian empire under the rule of Vladimir Putin, who back then and still now is driven by this explosive mixture of revisionism, revanchism, and irredentism. I mean, this toxic desire to exact revenge on Russia's neighbors, on the West writ large, to rearrange the international security order, and to redeem and reclaim what the Kremlin perceives as lost territories inhabited by Russian-speaking populations. So following the annexation of Crimea in March 2014, and the Russian attacks in the Donbass in the spring of that year, we in the West, especially at NATO when I was at the time, adopted this fancy term hybrid warfare to describe what the Russia's surreptitious actions at infiltrating societies and states in order to divide, disrupt, and sabotage without going to an overt conventional war whenever possible. Until that time, we may have lacked this proper terminology to describe Russia's actions, but it doesn't mean that this type of aggressive behavior on the part of Russia had no precedent, and quite the opposite. So Russia at the time used all domains of Russian power, and if you allow me a quick visualization, that I call this the Russian hybrid warfare Hydra. It's not meant to scare children at night, but it's meant to serve as a heuristic device, as a visualization, as I said, of how really everything is centralized, coordinated, coherent to the extent possible in this Russian global effort. Everything comes from the political head, the political warfare, and then uses all domains of national power, all those tools. Call them tentacles of the Hydra, we call them strands. But the point here is that it's a multi-domain operation that uses really all these, as I said, tools of national power. And I argue that even though we may have not had the term, but ultimately, if you look at those, with the exception of cyber, I would argue these are the same tools that the Russian Empire, the Tsarist Empire, the Soviet Empire had been using prior to 2014 for 3 or 4 centuries. I mean, at least since the 17th century when they started expanding into Ukraine. So we should have known better. We should have known that the way the Kremlin acts is not piecemeal. It's not really temporary, but it's a long-term strategy that combines all, as I said, all the instruments of national power. Also, for years on end, the Kremlin, Putin himself and his entire circle of political and military leaders had been communicating to us, openly about their pernicious intents and designs vis-a-vis Russia's neighbors and vis-a-vis us in the West. Remember that in 2005, Putin stated that, well, the collapse of the Soviet Union is the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 21st century. I mean, this means something. It's not mere propaganda. And I remember Putin's statement in Munich in 2008 that if NATO were to accept Ukraine and Georgia as members, then Russia would attack. Well, he didn't hesitate to follow up on his overt threats in August of 2008, actually during the Beijing Olympics, as you remember quite well, by attacking Georgia and by annexing South Ossetia. So what made us think back then that he would not do the same with Ukraine, with Moldova, with others, well, with any former member of the so-called Soviet Empire, the so-called neo-abroad, as the Kremlin likes to call them, anyone who dares to display independent behavior and develop pro-Western aspirations. Well, apparently the Obama administration, and here's me as a former Romney campaign guy, so apparently the Obama administration thought otherwise by assuming that the best response to the increasingly daring displays of Russian neo-imperialism was to launch the so-called reload of US-Russia relations. And of course that happened before Russia attacked Ukraine, but the trend was clearly set in the mind of the Kremlin decision makers. We know how well this played out, this attempt to extend an arm to Russia and engage them in some sort of productive diplomacy. You have all seen this ill-fated or notorious button that was supposed to say, reload. Instead, in Russian, it said overcharge. Yeah, and overcharge indeed it was, as it was misguided, naive, and frankly delusional. I say this as an American, but frankly, it was the wrong policy at the time. It really disregarded centuries of Russian imperialist expansionism, but also Putin's personal obsession with dominating Ukraine, in particular, as well as others, everyone who he deemed smaller and weaker at the time. Now, as you all know, we're in an academic setting, so there's this theory or principle that perceptions become reality in international affairs. So authoritarians such as Putin, they're particularly prone to acting upon the perceived weaknesses of their geopolitical adversaries, and of course they take advantage of those in due time. Also, what we should have known, that a year before the Maidan even, or a year before Russia attacked, the Russian military was talking and publishing openly about how they view the world of global affairs and global warfare. In February of 2013, General Gerasimov, the chief of general staff of the Russian armed forces, published his notorious article, "The Value of Science is in Foresight," which was dubbed the Gerasimov hybrid warfare model. Whatever we want to call it, the point is the Russian military was showing in an open source publication, nothing secret about it. It was an open source academic article based on a speech that Gerasimov made, that they view these clandestine and primarily non-military efforts as the backbone of 21st century warfare, as I said, driven by political warfare and information warfare, as you see. So we should have analyzed this. I mean, we all, the analysts of the West, the intel communities, anyone who was a Russia watcher, I mean, we should have known better, and because these were the harbingers of conflict, really. This type of talking, as I said, it wasn't just grandstanding, propaganda, disinformation. It was actually the Kremlin communicating to us what they wanted to do. So when the Maidan erupted in October 2013, and the Western politicians started flocking to Kiev, the Kremlin, logically, based on all that, saw, based on their really geopolitical paranoia and misperceptions, they saw this as yet another color revolution, which was aimed at the regional hegemony under the guise of Western support for democracy promotion. And of course, they logically and sadly began planning their aggressive steps, which were quite inevitable in retrospect, but also from the vantage point of 2014, I argue we should have known, we should have been better prepared. Ultimately, Russia always takes advantage, take advantage of its neighbors' temporary weaknesses, but also, unfortunately, of our own Western traditional indecisiveness in times of such political trials. So, of course, at the time, there were those with the right type of vision. Obviously, Senator McCain, years ago, before he passed, you remember he said that I saw 3 letters and put in his eyes the KGB, right? And then, Governor Romney in 2011, I was, for a second time, I was part of his presidential campaign. We, under his guidance, coined the phrase America's geopolitical adversary, Russia is America's greatest geopolitical adversary in the 21st century. As you remember, this was derided by Obama as being outdated and irrelevant. So, who is outdated now from the vantage point of 24? Unfortunately, the course of events has proven, without a shadow of a doubt, in my opinion, that this leading from behind doctrine, and of course the pivot to Asia, so this kind of functional and geographical dimensions of Obama's geopolitical doctrines at the time, this realignment of US strategic priorities were really no match for the Kremlin's all-of-government, multi-vector, multi-domain global campaign that lies at the core of it, what they call the Kremlin's hybrid hegemony. This model of expanding across Eurasia and beyond, if possible, with non-military means, if necessary, with military ones, as unfortunately we are still seeing in Ukraine. What is more, the administration's acts and words at the time really gave the wrong signal to Putin and his regime that America is, well, if not disinterested, but it isn't as committed to the fate of the former Soviet space, and is actually ready to delegate to others, in particular the European Union, to handle and resolve, if possible, any potential conflicts. I understand that there were, of course, experienced and dedicated diplomats. I know that. Victoria Nuland on the U.S. side, of course, who are knowledgeable about the region. In encouraging change in Ukraine, they were doing the right thing. It was quite admirable. However, a great power can only do so much by inspiring others to follow. It also needs to be able to flex its muscles when needed. And in this regard, I think the Obama administration's response to Putin's first hybrid invasion of Ukraine was somewhat incoherent and lacking, and ultimately, proved to be a wasted geopolitical opportunity to deter Russia in the early stages of the aggression, not only against Ukraine, but against the West. The current administration now has a chance to actually correct some of the wrongs. Let's hope this aid will not come at the 11th hour when it might be too late, because the situation is still quite dramatic. As we all know, we have members of the Ukrainian community here in the audience. So thank you for your attention, and thank you for everything you're doing for Ukraine.
Well, thank you very much, Mark, for reminding us of what was said and what was not done 10 years ago. And it's very interesting that the historical perspective makes certain episodes and discursive exchanges look very differently today as compared to what they did some time ago. We now come to our final formal presentation, which will be Sergey Utkin. So we look forward to your 10-minute presentation. Please proceed.
Thank you. I would probably start reacting to what Mark Voyger just said on our ability to foresee things and whether we should have known better what was to come. And on the one hand, I can just agree that in the hindsight we see things so clear that it's kind of hard to understand why is it that we did not expect them to happen before. But on the other, I think we all know that we are still, after multiple cases when this happened, when we thought, well, in hindsight it's so evident, we are still unable to predict the future. So it probably means that the world is still more complex than we sometimes think of it, and in many cases when it is sort of easy to understand what happened in history, it still doesn't give us a clue to figure out what is to come. And this is what all the scenario exercises are about. I think it's one of the tools that are very much demanded, also in terms of Russia's war in Ukraine. What could come next? People are trying to look into different scenarios. And I would just share some thoughts that I have at this point. Of course, I also don't have any crystal ball, and I also can just do some guessing game on what's to come, but I will share with you some thoughts that I have on how we could assess the war as it goes and the consequences of it. When I look at the impact made by this war on Ukraine, but also on Russia and on the world in general, I somehow come to this notion which has got popularized in the United States of forever wars. Forever wars, that was first coined as a critique to the wars that the US engaged in, the Vietnam, others. The latest occasion was when the notion of forever wars was kind of instrumentalized politically to explain why the US has to leave Afghanistan, to leave Iraq, and that was sort of one of the ways to use this notion of forever wars, like we don't want to have wars forever, that's why we have to withdraw. And I'm afraid what we are witnessing in case of Ukraine war is that the Russian leadership, and I would still, while I just heard what Mark said about centuries of Russia using more or less the same toolbox, I still think that political decisions are taken by concrete people who are currently in office. And this Russian leadership probably believes that a forever war in a certain form and shape which is bearable for the Russian system is not such a bad thing. They lived in their younger years through the Cold War. They were basically the knights of the Cold War as security apparatus of the Soviet Union back then. And they believed in their cause. They thought, well, we are fighting against a mighty opponent, which was mainly the United States and the United States allies. And after a period of what they see as a turmoil, what they see as sort of an intermission in this endless fight, they are back to this business. They feel like it is Russia's task in terms of what Russia is, in terms of what people call in the academia these days ontological security. It is Russia's task to stand up to what they see as US agenda. And that means that while things are mostly developing in Ukraine at this point, if this vision is maintained, if this remains a vision of the Russian leadership for some time, I wouldn't dare to say that this will remain like this forever. Nothing is forever, really, only in terms of human beings' lifetime. It is. If we believe that this is the vision that will be maintained by this group of people that is running Russia, then we can expect worst-case scenarios indeed to repeat time and again. So we are already within one of those worst-case scenarios, in the sense that we could hardly imagine the scope of the challenges that Ukraine is now facing and the whole Europe is now facing as a result of this disastrous war. But we probably still believe, most of us, that this war will end in bankruptcy for this Russian effort, that this Russian effort to redraw the map of Europe to achieve the goals that Mr. Putin has on his mind will end in a catastrophe for the countries that started it. This is the mainstream view that is behind the support for Ukraine and behind most of the actions that have been undertaken in the last 2 years. But that means that we kind of think less about what most people in the West and beyond would agree is the worst case scenario, which is if this does not happen, if Ukraine is not able to regain the territories lost to Russia, if Ukraine is not able even to stand on the contact line, and the Russian basically territorial gains, I think we all understand that this is like speaking the language of 19th century, but this is the kind of policy that is being implemented on the Russian side. If these territorial gains continue, then what kind of world we get as a result of that? What kind of a world we will live in? It's kind of easy to say, well, this would be judged as unacceptable by everybody, again, in the West and beyond. But very often, when we say unacceptable in politics, it means that we very much don't like what's happening, but in fact, we will live with what we call unacceptable. And this is, I think, a scenario we should be looking at closer, in the sense how we see our possible strategies in this case. There's a lot of talk about containment nowadays all around the Western community, that the containment is what helped to win the Cold War and what can help to win in this confrontation with Russia. But containment can work on a general scale, so on a global scale. Containment may not help you to win regional war, and the war in Ukraine is still the one. So in this sense, I think it is sort of on high demand to look into these scenarios. We definitely don't like them to happen, but we need to understand how to act if these scenarios actually start to surface in front of our eyes. What the war is doing to Ukraine, I think it's obvious to everyone. It's just disastrous consequences of all the bombings and destruction, and then the long-term impact on the economy and the population. But what will also determine the world and the kind of Europe we will live in will be the impact of the war on Russia. So the war is changing Russia in a number of ways. Dmitry Lithuanian, who used to run Carnegie Moscow Center and who is now known for his completely pro-war attitude, he just wrote a piece for RT, which is also the Russian resource state-funded that you all know, that Russia is undergoing what he calls an invisible revolution. And he basically means that Russia is finding itself in this war against Ukraine and the confrontation with the West. It's probably, it's probably a similar logic to what Mark just said about Russian toolbox being the same for centuries, and sort of Russia now rediscovering this toolbox. But I still think that this line of argument that Training is offering is the line that will definitely please the current Russian leadership, but in the longer run, you will have different groups in Russian society. Some of them would be pleased by this vision, and some they would work against it, because of course you do have groups that basically benefit from the war in a number of ways. The military industries, you have a lot of people who engaged in military action directly and who are now promised that they will be the new elite of Russia and that they will be treated as heroes. If this doesn't happen, this group, they will be frustrated. They will probably try to do something to compensate for the losses that can appear if the war doesn't go the way they would like to go. And there will be groups that will say, look, it's just not the kind of confrontation we can withstand for a longer time. So it can happen that the war would lead to a sort of a hangover in Russia, and the question whether policies should be reconsidered in spite of this toolbox being around sort of for centuries, it can arise. This is what the Russian leadership probably doesn't want to happen, but it's not like everything develops in accordance with what they think. This is what the Russian society should be preoccupied with. But for the West, I think that means that it's both unnatural to exclude the possibility that this policy that Russia is now pursuing is there forever. It's most probably it's not forever, so you can anticipate the change at some point. But at the same time, you should prepare to face probably years until this change is happening. And in this time frame, you need to figure out what the strategy could be. And we see that you already have basically a generation growing in places like Crimea who barely remember what happened in 2014. For people on this panel, 2014 still feels like yesterday. For younger people, it feels like ancient history. And if people spend their whole life basically at school working in accordance with the Russian government set curricula, if they now join Russian universities, this will have impact for years and years to come. So basically, my point is that we should prepare for worst case scenarios, and one of the problems is that there is no solution to just get back to point A prior to 2014. The war is leaving the kind of traces that we will probably witness for the rest of our lives and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sergey Utkin. Now, Baroness Ashton, is it all right for you to step up to the podium and offer us a few reflections on what you've just heard?
If I start with a couple of things I think that Vygaudas said at the beginning about the point of negotiations and the importance of thinking strategically about it. It does seem to me that not only do we have to be aware that eventually, whenever that day comes, negotiations of one form or another, as I was saying earlier, will happen, but also that this is much more, in a sense, than just the importance of Ukraine. We have the issues that are unresolved, conflict in Georgia. I can recall going to visit the monitoring mission in Georgia, and that the barbed wire would move a few centimetres or inches every now and then. And I'd get a text message saying, it's moved again, and then it moved back. That the constant determination to create countries that are not whole in terms of how they can operate seems to me something that Russia has developed as a strategy. It can take the form of taking pieces of land so that those countries can't spend their energy trying to develop a sovereign nation, so having to spend some of it worrying about what's going on in a part of their country. It means it's harder for them to join other organisations who don't want to import problems of countries that are not whole. It means it's much more difficult for them to speak for their whole nation without somebody saying that you don't necessarily represent it all of that. And I saw that being used very much at the beginning of this crisis, when Russia would say, who are these people? When the foreign minister of Ukraine or the prime minister of Ukraine is in the room, they do not represent everyone. It's a ploy that is used. So in terms of negotiation and thinking strategically, we have a whole security architecture for Europe to work out. That means we have to think about Moldova, we have to think about Georgia, we have to think about Ukraine, and I would argue we need to think about what's going to happen in Central Asia. Countries like Kazakhstan and others who are concerned about where all this goes. Remember, their position can be challenging as well. Whatever you think about countries or regimes in those parts of the world, it's still really important to contemplate what we can. And that means, my second point, that we have to think much more long term. I'm often saying to people on a number of crises that we're facing at the moment, if you look back decades, you can see the beginnings of problems. If you look forward, we need to think in decades about how we resolve them. So we need strategies that take us 50 years ahead, not just 5 or 10, because we know only too well that it doesn't work if we think far too short term. Mark knows I'm going to say I disagree with him about Obama, because I worked with President Obama, and he said to me, have I been a bit harsh? And the answer is yes. The phrase leading from behind is not Obama's, it's President Mandela's. And it's in a speech and in a part of his book when he talks about the need to show that you will let people lead with you or be in front of you. But, he says, you must be prepared to lead from the front when necessary. I paraphrase. So it is an important phrase that gets, in my view, turned around sometimes, because it does have some value. But, and I would also say to Mark, of course, if they don't get the aid, it's not the Democrats who are going to stop it in Congress, it's the Republicans. But it's certainly not the Mitt Romney Republicans who would stop it. Far, far from it. John McCain was still alive. He would be the first one to be arguing for aid and weaponry to go to Ukraine. So this is not about me saying anything negative about Republicans. But the point that you make about President Obama is what I just want to touch on, which is about the nature of domestic politics affecting how things work internationally. And it takes me to what's happening with farmers in Poland, or to what's happening in other countries who are beginning to raise this issue of Ukrainian products coming in to the markets. And it reminds me so much that when you think about the European Union, and my point about 27 sovereign nations, is that every one of those leaders who comes into the European Council does not leave their little bag marked domestic problems at the door when they come to sit down. Far from it. They are domestic politicians with oppositions who are willing to take their place if they get it wrong, and they have domestic issues to face. So presidents coming in on a platform of no more wars, or politicians coming in on a platform of building the economy, when faced with sanctions that are going to affect their own economy as much as anyone else's, or faced with having to take on groups of populations who are very strong and vocal in their own countries, have to take on board the politics of the domestic. It's not an excuse, it is a genuine problem. So whenever the Americans would say to me, how come you can't get sanctions from all of your countries to be put on Moscow or Iran or whoever immediately? The answer was often, especially with Russia, that in order to do that, they were going to have to take a hit to their economy that was going to translate into people's jobs. The Commission found ways to support them to enable that not to be a problem, but it took time. And if any one of those countries had said, we will not do sanctions, the sanctions regime would collapse. So you had to hold all 27, in my case 28 countries, to be prepared to take the hit. And when you've got oppositions willing to say, I wouldn't do that, it's very difficult. And then my last point is about the question of forever wars, and really to pick up a couple of things that Sergey was saying. It's really important to recognise how wars are the same and how they've changed. Whether it's drones and trenches in Ukraine, or whether it's what the Baltic states have witnessed for a long time, Estonia being the great example of how to combat that in terms of what they have done on cyber warfare, but also the disinformation campaigns, the interference in elections, the willingness and ability to motivate groups of populations that have got an affinity elsewhere to be troubled. We are living through a time when we are in the foothills of understanding the capacity of AI, the capacity of cyber warfare, the ability and willingness of people to deploy this to undermine and destroy our democratic way of life. And I don't say that lightly, because it's very clear to me that in the future, when we think about what we're going to have to do, we're going to have to build a level of protection and way of working that is going to make sure that we're able to combat this in ways that are only just coming into view and only just coming into our imagination as possibilities. And those are the forever wars, in my view, that we have to be extremely mindful of.
Well, thank you very much for those responses. We started late, so we can overdraw a little bit. I've got lots of questions, but I'm going to hold back and open it up to the floor. I already see one hand up. And if you would, I know who many of you are, but if you would, for the benefit of the room, always give your name and your affiliation if you have one, please.
James Oates, Centre for Geopolitics, I guess. Many years ago, Vygaudas, you said something to me which I remember and quote regularly. You said that Russia deals with two kinds of partner, enemy or slave, which is a wonderful line and I quote it regularly. Objectively, Umberto Eco gives, 14 tests for fascism, and Russia passes all of them. My question then is, how do you negotiate with what is essentially, openly, a fascist state?
Shall I answer now?
Yes, go ahead.
Well, I mean, my answer, you negotiate from the position of strength. I mean, that's first. And that's why, you know, from the very beginning, with all due respect, I know Kathy and myself and a lot of our colleagues in Brussels and elsewhere, you know, were advocating for a much tougher stand against Russia. If we would have adopted similar, if we were in a position to gather and garner support, political will of 28 at that time or 27 now, what we have done it during the last, as a response to 22 war, back in 2014, I think we would have a bigger chance to deter Putin from further adventures. But the answer is, I mean, Putin respects only force. He respects the might. And, you know, with all due respect, I mean, some people say, well, Emmanuel Macron, I mean, had worked in the best information war tradition to mislead, or at least not to give, you know, limits to Putin on the Western possible support. But that is exactly what we need. We don't only need, I mean, you know, the information war games, but we need to have contingency plans in place. How we're going to support Ukraine? How we'll not let Putin to go over Dnieper, and not only Dnieper, because, I mean, let's be very honest. His plans are to push his borders as further to the west as possible. And I don't want to see that going over Nemunas or River Wisla. And that's why we have to be very serious, and we count on support of NATO allies.
Thank you. Now, I know there's some of you who are shy, have questions. If you have a question, this is an opportunity to ask it. But while you're gathering your thoughts, Anna Wieslander.
Thank you so much. So I'm Alexander, I'm Director for Northern Europe at the Atlantic Council. I have two questions. One for Sergey, perhaps, following up on the forever war argument. In a way, I was thinking that in 2014, Russia started this war in Ukraine, Crimea, the war in Donbass, kind of a war without ending, creating open wound in Ukraine, making it dysfunctional, making it, closing the road to the west, having parts of it occupied by others. So what happened then in 2022 that kind of changed this logic? Is it still the same logic? Or, I mean, another reading is that Putin got tired of this kind of forever war, keeping the wound open strategy, and wanted to install a puppet government in Kiev very quickly, failed, and now is stuck with something else. So is it really a forever war now, or is there something else that he wants to see as the end goal? What is your assessment? And then perhaps on Catherine's vision of the European security architecture, would be interesting to hear from the panel, you of course, but also the others perhaps, what is Russia's role in such an architecture? If we are to think long-term now, and not only 5-10 years, but 20-30 years, we wanted to have it all-inclusive, but that's how we created it. Now, several countries see Russia as a threat also long-term, because we know from history now that it's very hard to trust Russia, but what kind of architecture can we foresee?
So should we go to Sergey first?
Well, I had difficulty to listen to answer this under question. It was just bad sound quality, but I understand that the question was about well, since Russia started the war in 2014, how it sees things developing and how it sees it is supposed to end in Putin's vision.
Sergey, sorry, I'll summarize the question. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I think the question was, Putin had a forever war, and I understood the question to be, why did he not continue the forever war? Why did he launch a full-scale campaign which, had it been successful, would have ended that war?
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, I still think, I understand why people say that the war is basically continuing for 10 years. And on the Ukrainian side, it's pretty clear since the initial violation of territorial integrity, that's how they count. But I still think, there's a qualitative difference between what happened before 2022 and what is happening now. We had one scenario exercise that was planned like, well, several options on the table, and one of the options was a low-intensity war as a sort of continuation of what we've witnessed these days. And surprisingly enough, it turned out that this option of low-intensity conflict just doesn't hold. You understand very soon after sort of digging into the matters that it may not just be maintained as low-intensity conflict because of the level of disagreements, to put it mildly, between the warring parties because of other factors. What helped to make the war low intensity sort of in these first 8 years was still maybe very imperfect, maybe very flawed, but still a negotiated de facto ceasefire agreement. So the Minsk agreements, they were blamed by everybody, but they were helping to make it low intensity. And then we get to sort of indirectly to the first question asked, how can you negotiate with this kind of Russian government? Whether you can expect any kind of deal. And I think Ukraine wouldn't be willing to make any kind of deal if they have an option of not making one. And then we get again into these worst case scenarios. What if they just have no other option? What happens if Russia is able to hold control of the territories that it already controls, and probably more? Would there be a possibility to say, well, okay, this is the outcome of the war, and we continue from that, talking on other topics and sort of settling some kind of ceasefire? I have my strong doubts whether we can do that. I understand that definitely nobody in Ukraine and in the West want this to happen, but if this is sort of the only option available, what would people do? Would they say, well, then we will just continue with the fight, and if we lose, we lose, but we will still not have any agreement with this kind of Russian government under the circumstances that we think are just disastrous? Or will there be some kind of an option to still consider a negotiated solution? At this point, frankly, if you ask me, I don't see options for negotiated solutions. I still see determination on the Western side to provide support to Ukraine in spite of a number of bottlenecks that appeared in this regard. To the main question that I'm asked about, why Putin didn't stop at what he had before 2022, I think still he somehow felt this didn't let him implement his ambitions. As one of the observers said, he got bored with the kind of Russian Federation that existed prior to 2022. He thought it's not ambitious enough, it's not at the level of this historical Russian greatness, and he felt like he had to draw new red lines, also in territorial terms, against any kind of Western influence. We also see how fiercely he's implementing new measures to fight against Western influence inside Russia, sort of against the people who agree with the Western assessment of the war. So he basically, indeed, it's a kind of revolution in a sense, as Islamic revolution was in Iran, to reshape the country, to make people aware that they just have to support the government, which is fighting the war against the mighty opponent. And so far, it kind of works. It helps him to monopolize all mechanisms of the Russian politics and to maintain power for probably many more years, which is, of course, one of the desires exercised by authoritarian politicians, as we know.
Thank you. So I'm afraid we're running out of time. So with your permission, I won't take the second part. I'll take the final two very quickly, and then you can fold your answers to the second part of Anna's question into your response. First was Eric, and then, yes. Well, actually, we'll go with you first, but very quickly, if you would.
Thank you. I'm Vygaudas Ušackas. I was speaker at the panel earlier. My question is very straightforward. Should the West invest in promoting democratic change in Russia? And if so, how?
Answer the last question.
As we all know, we celebrate today the 75th anniversary of NATO, and it's much of the most effective treaty organization of the world. And we had a lot of crises
close to war, starting with the Berlin Brigade, the Korean War, the uprising in Hungary in 56, the Cuba crisis, the uprising in Czechoslovakia, and so on and so on. And the fundamental principle of NATO was always to stress the necessity of military strength and combine it with dialogue and consultation and negotiations. It's our principle since the Hamel doctrine, since the 60s. And my question is why we don't practice that with regard to the Ukrainian war. We have no strategic concept to come out of the war. We have no realistic political aims. And we have no idea what we can do. We are waiting for a reload of American-Russian relations, maybe, after Donald Trump will take over the government in Washington. But from my European position, it's not enough. I mean, what shall we do if they make a big deal in November and come to whatever peace regulation and stuff like that? I mean, then we face a similar scenario that we had in the end of the Afghanistan engagement. 20 years we were there, and suddenly the Americans started to talk to the Taliban, the devil, yeah, and came to a conclusion, and we had to accept it. I feel very uncomfortable.
Thank you very much. So there are a lot of questions there, and I think possibly they won't all be answered, certainly not as fully as they deserve to be. So what I'm proposing to do is just to go to the panel and ask you to respond for a minute to whichever question you feel able to, and I'll begin with Mark and work my way through.
Okay, yes, may I tackle just the latest comment? Yes, sir, you're absolutely right. Your compatriot, Dr. Stephanie Babst, would agree with you. She just published a book, as you know, as end as August, The Blind Spots of the West, talking about the need for NATO containment. So I see more and more Europeans actually thinking about this grand strategy. It's no longer, the American umbrella, so to speak, is no longer guaranteed. Unfortunately, you mentioned, of course, the ominous potential return of Trump. What should Europe do? I mean, the strategic autonomy is something that's that's been a combination of words that's been played around. Whether that's possible or not, I'm a bit skeptical at the level of, let's say, the ability of the military industry at this point to even supply, the problems we have with supplying Ukraine with the right right quantities rather of ammunition. But it's better to be done now than later. Obviously, later will be maybe too late with Trump's advent. Again, there's no easy answer, and I'm encouraged that people like you are, and others are thinking in this direction. It's a wake-up call for Europe. That's what I would go with.
Thank you. Kathy.
I mean, very briefly, the kind of security architecture is not some great grand strategy as far as I can see. It's about how do you make sure that Russia doesn't simply withdraw from Ukraine, regroup and come back in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. What is it that's happened? What have we done that means it won't and it can't? And that's a combination of all the things that people have been talking about, from strength and military hardware stuff and what happens on borders and creating security within the Baltic states. And it's also about, are there things we can talk to Russian people about? Is there a level of dialogue? Is there a way that they get access to what we're thinking and have the kind of relationships and so on? All of that stuff. Because not just hard power, it's soft power used as hard power. Final comment, the EU has never understood how strong it is. As an economic power, it is enormous, and it doesn't yet really get that it has the capability to use that incredible economic strength to achieve things outside of simply thinking about the internal issues.
Thank you. Very, very concise. Vygaudas.
Well, all was said. So, not to repeat, just to add, I wasn't remain pessimistic about West and Russia going together back to normal anytime soon. Also because I'm pessimistic about internal developments of Russia, about the passivism of Russian society, about lack of tradition to opposition, to democracy, etc. Having said this, the best recipe, Dovydas, for all of us is Ukraine's victory. It's about having Ukraine a modern country, a member of European Union and NATO, which would lead by example other countries, including Russians themselves, who would think twice, wouldn't it be better to live in a normal country with democratic principles and the rule of law and human rights respect than under Putin's regime or whoever is going to be after him. I personally am very pessimistic, and I don't think that after Putin leaves, in one way or another, we're going to have a democratic leader in Russia. I go back to Lyudmila Alexeyeva, Sergey will know her very well. One was the founder of the Helsinki Act committee in Moscow. When I met her before departing from Moscow, she said to me, Vygaudas, she said, yes, it will take probably 2.5 generations of Russians to come closer to your values and your way of living and respect to each other and a state individual relationship. But at the same time, never give up. And we have to be ready at some stage to embrace that change, stage, which will be a different, but I don't expect, I hope I'm wrong, but I don't expect that the things will get easy with either Putin or whoever is going to be after him. And that's why Ukraine is so critical importance to all of us in the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that's almost the last word, but that in fact goes to Sergey, if you would like it, but only 1 minute, please.
Yeah, actually the sound quality has been poor, so I will just focus on one question that I heard about the democratic transition in Russia. I think you cannot really construct a democratic transition from outside any country. We saw how it was impossible in easier cases than the Russian ones, so you probably will have to wait for quite some time until things change in the country. But in the meantime, I think what's important for the West is to demonstrate the kind of resilience and dynamics that has not always been there, and that lack of resilience and dynamics on the Western part makes more and more people around the world to think, hey, well, maybe democracy is not the kind of system that works, maybe it's not what helps us to deliver, to achieve the levels of richness, prosperity that we want to achieve. We go to some Arab monarchies and we like it there more than we like in the West. And I think this we're working on your own performance, trying to improve the level of this performance in the West is very important, so that people would see that a democracy can actually provide the level of resilience that is necessary in this turbulent world.
Thank you very much indeed. Unfortunately, we do have to finish now. I have overrun even my overrun. But I think that is a tribute to the quality of the contributions, to the probing nature of the questions and the sheer importance of the subject matter itself. But for now, it's my pleasure to invite you to lunch, which you go through for which you go through the doors there and turn right where you had coffee. And of course, ask you formally to thank our excellent panel for stimulating such a discussion.